So what I thought I would do is take you through a little guided practice so that there would be an experiential component, and then talk briefly about one way to look at the endeavor of mindfulness, and then open it up primarily for questions and interactions and so forth, just to give us a chance to be together and to talk in an uninhibited way. So that's going to sort of be the program, and we'll start with a few minutes of guided practice. You can just follow along. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. We're okay? Okay, good. Take a moment to stretch up and settle in. The erectness of the spine through alignment and balance is a kind of expansive force that pulls you upward to Father Sky. And then the rest of the body just hangs limp and loose. The face goes smooth, the jaw drops. The shoulders fall, the arms are limp. The anti-gravity muscles in your legs are happy, they don't have to work. So the appendicular body, the 5 limbs, 2 arms, 2 legs, and neck up, it feels the contractive force of Mother Earth through gravity. The muscles relax. And in the core, on each out-breath from beginning to end, the muscles relax. There's no effort in the out-breath. Gravity does it for you. That's also part of the contractive force. So the aligned spine and the rest of the body just hanging limp and loose. This posture alone is an entire path to enlightenment. Now, we're going to explore our sensory experience in a systematic way. We'll start with eyes closed. Even with your eyes closed, you could have visual experience. You might see darkness or brightness. You might have visual thoughts, mental images, even colors. There could be swirling energy, pixelation, and so forth. So you might see internal activation associated with thinking, mental images, in other words. You might see a restful, undifferentiated, dark, bright, or gray. There might be stability, there might be flow and movement. So even with your eyes closed, there is visual experience. Certainly there is auditory experience. You're hearing these sounds right now. You might hear your own mental talk or be aware of mental quiet. An absence of sensory experience is still a sensory experience. It can be. We can hear silence. We can see blank. And in your body, there will be physical sensations, perhaps emotional sensations, You'll also experience a restfulness in your body. You'll feel rest, which is what we tuned into when we first sat down. We felt the body relaxing into the posture. So your experience will alternate. Sometimes you'll have something that's visual. Could be active, restful, internal, external, stable, or flowing. You could have an auditory experience, sound or mental talk, or silence, or a kind of background hum of energy and vibration in your auditory space. You could be aware of physicality of the body, the emotionality of the body, the repose of the body, the stability or the flow thereof. We'll use the verb see for any visual experience, inner or outer, active or restful, stable or flowing. Any visual experience will be something we see. We'll use the verb hear for any auditory experience, mental talk, physical sound, the absence thereof, the fluidity therein. If it's auditory, it's something that we hear. We'll use the verb feel for anything in the body. Could be an emotional experience in the body, or a restful experience, or a sense of energy and flow, or just the pure physicality of the body. You feel your clothes, you feel the air, the ongoing physiology of breath and heartbeat. These are all things we feel. At any given instant, if you're aware of visual experience, pour all your attention into that visual experience. In that moment, try to have a complete experience of that. When you're aware of an auditory experience, do the same. Even if it's your mental chatter, really hear it. Pour your attention into it. Likewise for body experience. If you wish, you have the option, but not the requirement, to use a mental label to remind you what you're focusing on. If you're focusing on something visual, you could say to yourself, see, to remind yourself to really see it in that moment. Likewise for hear or feel. In order to keep things simple, however, we'll agree just for now to just focus on one modality at any given instant. Often two or all three will call you at the same time. But just as a mindfulness exercise for now, if two or three of the modalities call you, just choose one and really try to experience it for a couple seconds. And then be aware again, perhaps of the same experience or perhaps of a different experience. We'll call this process noting. You'll be noting exactly one of three things at any given instant. You're pouring your attention onto what you see, or you're pouring your attention onto what you hear, or you're pouring your attention onto what you feel. Remembering that there is a wide range of things that can be seen even with the eyes closed. Restful states, energy, mental images, those are visual. Mental talk, external sounds, silence, a background hum of energy, those are auditory experiences. In the body, the physicality, the emotionality, the energy, the repose, all of these can be felt. As you do this, you may have thoughts of past, future, fantasy, planning, memory, and so forth. That's perfectly okay. But part of that may involve mental picture. Be sure to really see the visual part of the thought. Or part of the thought may involve mental talk. Really hear it. Whose voice? Is it loud or soft? Is it just a hint? In your ears, in your head? This will make the thinking process sensory and tangible and even localizable. Visual thoughts occur in image space. Auditory thoughts occur in talk space, mental talk space. So it's okay if you have thoughts, but be sure to see them or hear them as fully as possible. You may get impatient, antsy. That will probably take the form of an antsy sensation in the body, which is an emotional feeling. Or if you get bored, there'll probably be a feeling state. If you get sleepy, there's an impact on how your body feels. Any experience is fine. Our interest will be just in being clear. So even if there's some uncomfortable states of mind and body, that's okay. Try to open up to them. Be precise. What part of this experience am I seeing? What part of this experience am I hearing? What part of this experience am I feeling in my body? Once again, if you wish to use the option of mental labels, you can every few seconds say to yourself one of those three verbs of perception. See, hear, feel. We'll call that a mental label. Of course, mental label is part of what you hear, but you don't have to label the label. It's a scaffolding upon which you're standing in order to build the edifice of mindfulness. With this particular exercise, you don't need to intentionally create anything. Just let the sensory experiences arise spontaneously. You're taking a passive attitude. As you do this, be aware of 3 qualities that may be present. One of those qualities is clarity. You are clear in each moment, whether you're intentionally focusing on the visual, the auditory, or the somatic modality. That's a kind of untangling, a kind of sensory clarity with regards to your experience, the composition of your experience. Also, for just a brief moment, try to concentrate intently on the thing you see, hear, or feel, unless it vanishes instantly, which could happen. But if it sticks around for a few seconds, really be there with it. This is technically called karnika samadhi, or momentary high concentration. The third quality to be aware of is something that we call in English equanimity, upeksha. It's a kind of sensory detachment in the sense that you're willing to allow sensory experiences to come and go without push and pull. a kind of hands-off attitude, giving permission for the senses to function as part of the effortless flow of nature. If a mental image or mental talk or an emotional body sensation wants to arise, let it. If it wants to pass, let it. Our ordinary concept of being happy is pinned on the content of experience. If the mind can find an answer, the mind is happy. If the body can get comfortable physically and emotionally, the body is happy. Getting answers and getting comfortable is certainly a legitimate dimension of human happiness. But our interest here will be in gradually learning how to step into a different dimension of human happiness. A dimension of human happiness that is not dependent on the content of experience, but rather depends on the completeness of any given experience. This is an extraordinary concept. How complete a given sensory experience of mind, body, self, or world is can be measured by how much concentration, sensory clarity, and equanimity we bring to that experience in that moment. It turns out that even uncomfortable states of the mind and body, when experienced completely, don't cause suffering anymore. We've escaped into the experience. And pleasant ones yield greater fulfillment. It turns out that when we have complete experiences, our paradigm for our identity shifts. in subtle or perhaps stunning ways. It is that dimension that we are now beginning to explore in these few minutes. Sooner or later, you're going to get uncomfortable. You're going to get impatient. Your body's going to start to be uncomfortable. It'll get sleepy. The posture starts to get achy. The mind wants to go here or there. Perhaps begins obsessing, worrying, wanting it to be over. These are all the contents of experience. You will see them. You will hear them. And you will most assuredly feel them. Our job, gradually, patiently, develop the ability to experience these states of the senses mindfully. That is to say, completely. That is to say, in a state that is concentrated, sensorially clear and equanimous. For just a few more minutes, let's take some steps into that dimension. Strengthening our muscles. Continue to see. Continue to hear. Continue to feel. Now, we're going to do something which will have an impact on our senses. It could cause emotions in the body. It will definitely have an impact on what you see. And the thing that we're going to do is to open our eyes. Eyes open, but continuing with the noting technique. Once again, take a moment to stretch up and settle in. Now, of course, you have the vivid world of color and form. You're seeing that. You might also still be seeing mental images if you get involved in memory plan fantasy. If you're having will or desire, maybe you hear mental talk, you certainly hear my voice. Maybe things are a little less comfortable with the eyes open. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe that's more comfortable, which would be an emotional impact in the body. Okay, good. Now, if you wish, you can drop that formal technique, or if you want, you can continue to have it going in the background. So I'm going to talk for a couple minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers, if just whatever you'd like to discuss. If at some point you need to use the washrooms, they're over here. Feel free to avail yourself of happiness dependent on conditions. Okay, so here's the way I like to think about mindfulness. I like to think of it in terms of basic interrogatives, basic questions, and then I have my own favorite ways of answering those questions. Now, of course, other people may elect to answer those questions about mindfulness in very different ways than I do. There is that freedom. So the first basic interrogative is, what is mindful awareness? So the way that I personally like to think about it is, it's an attentional skill. And indeed, we were just practicing that attentional skill. And mindful awareness as an attentional skill has three characteristics. It's one of the skills or sub-skills is the ability to concentrate. And we'll define that as the ability to attend to what you deem relevant for as long as you want, whenever you want. Does that sound like a useful skill? I think that's a useful skill. The second skill we'll call sensory clarity. You can think of it as the ability to untangle the strands of your sensory experience. Or you can think of it as the opposite of being flooded. If you've ever had the experience of being overwhelmed because too much was happening all at once in too many places, the overwhelm was because of the tangling. You could train yourself to track those sensory elements. They would not tangle into a sense of overwhelm. So sensory clarity, you can think of it as the opposite of being overwhelmed by these senses being tangled together. Equanimity, you can think of it as the ability to allow sensory experience to come and go without push and pull. Now, you notice I said you can think about these skills this way. I didn't actually say I'm defining them this way, because there's more to it, a lot more to it. But at least to get an idea of what I'm talking about, you can think of concentration, clarity, and equanimity in these ways. If you want the full detailed version, you can read my long essay, What is Mindfulness? Most people have experienced mindfulness or the lack of mindfulness. So I basically take a Socratic method when I teach people. I assume that most human beings have at some point in their life either had the experience of becoming extraordinarily concentrated or clear or equanimous, or they've had the experience of the opposite of that happening, and they noticed that things didn't go very well when the opposite of that happened. So you have these three skills, and most human beings have had an experience of either spontaneously dropping into concentration or clarity or equanimity and noticing how incredibly cool that was. Or if they haven't had that experience, they've had the experience of the opposite, of how things suck when you're scattered or when you're fighting with your own senses, et cetera, et cetera. So when I teach this, I assume that people actually already know at least some of this from their life experience. They just needed to be pointed out to them, which was the way that Socrates taught. He assumed people already knew stuff, but they didn't really know that they knew it. So this is the way that I like to define mindful awareness: concentration power, sensory clarity, and equanimity working together. And if there is one discovery that the East has made that is of worldwide significance. It is the discovery that these skills are cultivatable. Just as you can get better at playing a musical instrument, or you can get stronger by lifting weights, with systematic practice, you can dramatically elevate your base level of C, C, and E, concentration, clarity, and equanimity, aka mindful awareness. And we'll define your base level of mindful awareness to be how mindfully aware you are in ordinary life when you're not particularly trying to be that way. That's your base level, and that can be elevated. In other words, it goes on automatic pilot with enough practice. Okay, so that's sort of a quick answer to what is mindful awareness, the first interrogative. The second interrogative, naturally, would be, what do you think? We said, here's what it is. What might be some other interrogatives? How do you get it? Might be another interrogative. What might be another one?
Why?
Why do you want it? What would be another interrogative?
When?
When? And what might be another one?
How fast?
Is it easy?
That's sort of, these are part of the how. Let's take those as subsets of how.
Where?
Where would be an interrogative, I think a legitimate one. And maybe let me throw out a couple other ones just for the fun of it. Interrogatives that aren't used anymore but should be because they sound really cool and they are part of English. Whence and whither. You know what whence means? It means from where. And whither means to where, as in whither goest thou, quo vadis, and so forth. So we might say what, why, where, when, how, whence, meaning where did mindfulness come from historically, and whither, meaning where might it be going in the future. That would pretty much cover the story. Now let's see if I can squeeze that into about 15 minutes. Well, we already got the what, and if you got that, you got a lot. By the way, are you still clearly seeing, hearing, and feeling? When you were laughing and we were smiling, okay, etc., etc. Or if you're making comments to yourself, oh, wow, this makes sense, or this doesn't make sense, or where's this going? You hear your own mental talk, etc. Okay, so now let's try the why. Well, why should we do this? Shall I count the ways? Why do I love mindfulness? Why do I love these? Let me count the ways. Well, one answer to the why question. So that we can be really happy. There's the one concept answer. Of course, then the immediate question is, well, what do you mean by really happy? Because, you know, for some people, happiness might be a very superficial notion. The true happy, truly happy, that adjective carries huge weight. So yeah, I can give you the one phrase answer. The Buddha did. Ditta Dhamma Sukha Vihara. A vihara means to abide. Sukha means, in this case, happiness. Ditta Dhamma means in the here and now. Drishta Dharma in Sanskrit, Ditta Dhamma in Pali. To be happy in the here and now. That was one, that's sort of the one concept answer. But then we have, you know, immediately anybody is going to question, well, what do you mean by happiness? So, well, I intimated that happiness might have more than one fundamental dimension. During the guidance, I don't know if you were listening carefully, but I talked about, well, one dimension of happiness is the content of your experience, what you're experiencing. But another dimension of happiness is how fully you experience something. And you'll notice, if you listen carefully, I said both of those dimensions are legitimate. Well, guess what? Mindful awareness skills impact both of those dimensions. So we can start to tease out the issue of human happiness in a lot of different ways, and we can have small integers. I can give you a 3-dimensional model for human happiness. I can give you a 4-dimensional, a 6-dimensional, teasing out the dimensions. The point being that however many dimensions we may distinguish, and however many depths we may distinguish within those dimensions, mindful awareness impacts all of them. Some directly, some indirectly in ways that you might not superficially be aware of, but when you think about deeply, you'll see that that's the case. So one model might be, well, I sort of intimated, okay? There's happiness that I get in my mind when I get answers to specific questions. Then there's the unhappiness that I get in my mind if I don't have answers. Well, it turns out that you can have a sensorially clear experience of being intellectually confused. And that's actually an empowering experience. It also turns out that concentration, clarity, and equanimity skills make you smarter. I have not a scintilla of doubt that my IQ has vastly increased. My ability to do academic work vastly increased due to 45 years of mindfulness practice. So it actually makes you smarter, and it also makes you be able to have a meaningful experience of being dumber. Which, by the way, is all of our futures. I'm almost 70 now, and I see, okay, this is all downhill. But I know how to have a meaningful experience of meaninglessness. And although that may seem like some weird and perhaps even cruel wordsmithery, I am telling you that this is something important to know. The mindfulness skills don't go away even when you get senile. They're at a, I hate to say the phrase, but a cellular level, okay? It's not an intellectual skill, it's a sensory clarity skill. By the way, that's part of the answer to the where. We cultivate the mindfulness in our sensory circuits, not in our self, not in our ego, not in our executive functions, which may deteriorate. It's right down there in the sensory circuits itself. It's at a very primitive level. And so it could actually survive senility and so forth. I mean, to a certain extent, you're still going to get senile, but it's just different. And if any of you know advanced meditators that are going through that process, you see the difference. Anyway, that's a little tangent. So we can have a lot of different ways of sort of breaking up the issue of human happiness. Talk about happiness that's dependent on conditions. We can talk about happiness independent of conditions. We could talk about happiness relative to our sensory experience. We can talk about happiness relative to making positive behavior changes in how we carry ourselves in the world. We can talk about happiness for our own personal world. We can talk about happiness in the sense that we're happy when we serve a larger world and make the world a better place. These are all dimensions of human happiness, and every single one of them is facilitated by mindful awareness, either directly or indirectly. So one way that I said we could count all sorts of different ways to sort of tease out the issue of human happiness. One that I like to use, it's a little strange sounding, but works for me, is as human beings we have 3 jobs. So 3 jobs, when we fulfill these 3 jobs, we're happy as human beings. The first job is to appreciate the self and the world sensorially as it arises moment by moment. The second job is to get over the self and the world, to transcend the self and the world, to have an experience that, a direct experience of something that is beyond time and space, and that could even be called the source of time and space. So, appreciate the self and the world, transcend the self and the world. Now, maybe one thing's left. What's left to do? What do you think? Could there be another job besides appreciate and transcend? Well, that would be the transcend, actually.
Socialize.
Improve the self and the world. How about that? Well, it turns out that these three jobs are very related. If you take appreciate to its limit, you will touch the formless. And if you've touched the formless, you've touched the source, and you want to, that gives you a place to stand, an Archimedean point from which you can move improve yourself. The ABCs of being a good human being: positive affect, positive behavior, positive cognitions. From that place outside the human, we can most efficiently improve the human. And furthermore, if you touch the source, you touch everyone's source. And a natural spirit of love and service will tend to flow from that, So it turns out that these jobs are related. Appreciate, have sensory appreciation. In other words, have complete experience, but complete experience leads to formless experience, which then leads to an increased ability to improve yourself and the world. I would claim that concentration power, sensory clarity, and equanimity are key skills for achieving those three jobs. That's just one way to look at, and I would also claim that that's a very broad perspective on human happiness. That is not a superficial perspective. It covers all the dimensions. So, okay, what is mindful awareness? Well, I like to think of it as concentration, clarity, and equanimity. Why practice it? Well, truly happy in any of the ways we're talking about. How do we practice it? We practice it by having at least one mindful awareness technique. Maybe you have many techniques, or maybe you just have one. It could be something simple, the breath. It could be something as complicated as what we just did, which is awareness of everything. You have at least one technique. You do it every day for at least 10 minutes in formal practice. And every year you do at least one intensive retreat. This is absolute minimum. In other words, you set up a regimen of practice, and you keep that up for the duration. I just gave you the minimum. That's how you elevate your base level of mindful awareness. Let's see, what? Well, we didn't do where. Well, we sort of did where. We do mindful awareness in our senses. In our visual experience, our auditory experience, our somatic experience, some combination or some subset thereof. In our senses, that's where we do mindful awareness. When do we do mindful awareness? Well, we do mindful awareness in the present moment, the now. Specifically, the catching of the instant of the arising of any sensory experience, and the catching of the instant of the passing of any sensory experience. Those moments of rising and those moments of passing are detecting exactly what happens when the formless breaks apart into form and self and world arise, and exactly what happens when that process reverses and form disappears back into the source. Self and world reunite with the source. Catching the beginnings and endings of each see, each hear, each feel, inner or outer, big or small, doesn't matter. Exactly the same process will occur hundreds and hundreds of times before I finish this talk. How many times will it be noticed by how many of you? Well, that's called the web. The now, the power of now. It's a great phrase, but concept is one thing. Actually developing the sensory skills to taste the power of now as you're just bopping around, interacting in the world, well, that may take a little investment, but it's well worth it. What, why, where, when, how? Not 15 minutes. Whence? Well, the concentration piece was discovered by almost every culture. The equanimity piece was quasi-discovered, but often confused with asceticism and even self-torture and so forth. So it took a little while for that to be clear. The sensory clarity piece is primarily, and I would also say the equanimity piece, but especially the sensory clarity piece, is primarily the work of one human being, who I consider to be the first and so far greatest scientist of human happiness. So who strongly emphasized the sensory clarity facet of mindfulness? Come on. The Buddha. Yeah. Concentration practices had existed in India. Ascetical practice had existed. He did both, if you remember his biography. Then he redefined the whole thing. He redefined asceticism from self-torture into equanimity. It's not how much it hurts that purifies consciousness. It's how much matter-of-factness you bring to the hurt. And oh yeah, by the way, it's not just unpleasant experiences. Pleasure purifies consciousness. Also, look at the jhana path, the absorptions. You're basically having completed, or even the tantric practices that came later, hundreds of years later. These are essentially fully mindful experiences of pleasure that purify consciousness. It's not easy to bring, I'll tell you, okay, it is not easy to bring equanimity to pleasure. It is much easier to bring equanimity to pain, which is why that is often more the path. It is very easy to fool yourself to think you're bringing equanimity to pleasure, okay? But in theory, listening to music or having great meals or having great making love, all of those with enough equanimity are absolutely paths to insight and purification. So sort of putting this all together, this was the genius of the Buddha. And particularly the discovery of untangle and be free, the sensory clarity component. So the whence is broadly all human civilizations, starting with our shamanic ancestors, without a doubt. You think of the Eskimo hunter at with a hole in the ice, squatting with a spear. And sometime in the next 3 days, a seal is going to poke up for about 30 seconds. And depending on that person's state of consciousness, they will either bring home a meal or they won't. So what's going to happen 3 days sitting in the snow, squatting, okay, looking at that hole? Is that person going to fall into a state of concentration, clarity, and equanimity? Yeah, I sort of think they are. I sort of think that lifestyle would tend to foster it. So this started with our remote ancestors. But it was the lifestyle and the shamanic ordeals, ceremonies that they did that sort of did this, but they didn't need systematic exercises. They didn't need a conceptual paradigm. That came later. And so on one hand, it sort of comes from all of humanity, the whence. But another answer to the whence is that a lot of this was the genius of the historical Buddha to sort of refine these things and put them all together. The whither, where this is all going, well, guess what? We're part of that. This is part of that. We're in on the ground floor of something that, who knows, 100 years, 200 years from now, when they look back, they might say, you know, God, those people at Amrik, how incredible that must have been to be part of what eventually was the human experience, okay? I'm not going to get all grandiose and say, I know that that's what the future holds, but I don't think it's ridiculous because what's happening now is if we consider the Buddha to be the first and so far greatest proto-scientist of human happiness, well, now we have like this other science. We've got real science. And it's starting in our time this mating dance of the best of the East and the best of the West. And we don't know what kind of wunderkinder, what kind of wonder children will be born from this union. We cannot say. Maybe nothing, okay? Or maybe something that just becomes the new paradigm for humanity because it just has everything you want and none of the things you don't want in terms of what humans really want. So that's a possible exciting future. And that is the end of my 7 interrogatives. Now we have time for some interactions. Yes, whatever you'd like to talk about. We've got about 20 minutes.
If you knew that you were going to be teaching mindfulness to veterans, both suffering from brain injury and PTSD and all the associated ills, would you teach it differently than what you did?
What I just did here?
Yes.
I would not give this talk to people that are just learning mindfulness. I think it is very useful to have all this information in your background so that you have a very clear conceptual framework of what you're doing. But then what you need to do is parcel this kind of stuff out in...
Oh, you've got a half an hour.
Huh?
You have a half an hour.
Right. So you're going to give, you're being asked to give a half an hour introduction to mindfulness to veterans that have these kinds of things. And you're asking, what kinds of things would you talk about? Clearly, what I just gave was far too heady and intellectual. So and doesn't seem practical or relevant to the average person. So what I would suggest is, first, look at prior art. Look at who is giving these kinds of presentations to that kind of audience and how are they going about doing it. So, you know, one thing that immediately comes to my mind is that there are people that are specializing in this. I have students that specialize exactly in veterans with PTSD and so forth. So one thing you might want to look at is, okay, well, what are people doing? Okay, and that might be an idea. Now, if you wanted me to make a guess how to do it, if like the original question was, if it's me, let's see here. Is this going to be a talk or is it going to be are they going to be able to have Q&A?
Well, it would be probably about 6 people in a room, and it would be both
Q&A?
Yeah.
My usual philosophy on these things is to draw out of people what they want, to let them talk. And okay, you could say, you know, there's this thing called mindfulness and there's a lot of scientific evidence that it can help. What would be some of the things that you would want to deal with, and then be equipped to show them how a mindfulness technique could help. I also typically, my typical strategy is I talk to the person or persons for a while. I get a sense of what they want, and then I say, okay, I've got 3 techniques. And each one of those techniques will give you what you want. Typically, they want some peace of mind, or deal with physical discomfort, or deal with negative emotions. And I briefly describe, say, 2 or 3 approaches, and then I ask them, what appeals to you? Which one of these would you like to start with? So I like to give people a choice as to what technique. Then you've got buy-in, rather than assuming that as the teacher I know what they should be practicing. So that might give you some general guidelines. If you shoot me an email, like Blake can give you my email address, I'll connect you with some people that are doing this kind of work. When do you have to give this talk?
Wednesday.
Today is what day?
Saturday.
Well, that's time. I'll make it happen. If you email me today, I'll get you the contact in the next day or two.
Thank you.
Yes?
Could you talk about what you alluded to, what you were seeing with advanced practitioners going through senility and, that stage?
Oh, yeah. So it's anecdotal, okay? Probably some actual research has been done. I'm not aware of it, but what I see is that, yeah, there's no way that to avoid the fact that they become senile. So you do get a diminishing in function, but there's a kind of peacefulness and gracefulness to it that smells different from the normal senility or Alzheimer's type situation. There's just a grace and ease to it, and you sense that on the inside it's a different experience than it is for other people. I remember the first time, well, see, I think I'm a pretty good mindfulness teacher, and probably one of the reasons is that I am like a really bad candidate for practice of meditation, just genetically and my upbringing and so forth. So I was like a really bad student in every way conceivable. And sometimes that can actually, if you stay with it, you actually get good because you sort of had to conquer all the things. So one of the ways that I was a bad student is that I was always trying to think of ways of stumping my teachers. Because they would make claims. I mean, I just made an incredible laundry list of claims. I mean, outrageous claims, actually, if you think about it. Happiness independent of conditions. I mean, having air to breathe is a condition, right? So, I mean, these are big claims. So I would try to, they would make claims. These were Asian masters, it's very senior level. And, they would say all this stuff, and I would try to stump them intellectually. I would try to figure out. So one of the things that I figured out is, because one of my teachers talked a lot about enlightenment, okay, Kensho Satori. So I said, well, what happens to an enlightened person if they become senile? That was like, okay, I'm going to stump him with this one. And I don't actually remember what the answer that he gave me. I mean, maybe he just like yelled at me or something, I don't know. But sure enough, about 15 years later, I'm in a situation where I'm supposed to be interpreting for a Japanese master, a very famous master, and he is really, really senile. And I was with him. I was actually like with him, in the day, taking care of him, talking to him, and whatever. And so I got to really see it up close. And there was just this incredible gracefulness in his movements. He would just sort of look off into space, and it was just like, you could see there was, he was losing it, but it was just beautiful. And he could still talk, though. And he could actually get up and give a lecture. And it was coherent. But he told me, he said, personally, I have no idea what I'm saying. I just get up there, and there's just this fog. And there are these words. But in the audience, it was fairly coherent. So apparently he was also functioning a little higher than he should, given what his sensory experience was. And that's probably just that lifetime of samadhi, some sort of carryover. I'm guessing. But I just say there seems to be less suffering and more grace in it, would be my summary of what I've seen so far. Good. Yes?
I'm intrigued with your statement that you're genetically a
bad student. Is that figurative or?
Oh, that's a great question. We don't know at this point to what extent genetics enter in. I mean, but genetics do enter into skills, right? I mean, Muhammad Ali had some real special, muscle fibers, okay? And I don't know the answer to this. It's not unreasonable that there are genetic proclivities towards or against this kind of stuff. I've noticed that it tends to run in families. Now you could say, well, of course, because it's conditioning, they're in the same family. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I mean, if I will have a student that does very well, and then I'll notice that their brothers and their parents also seem to do very well. So maybe genetics enters in. I was speaking with a little less than full rigor. This is based on, yes, that's math jargon, I love that. Speaking with less than full rigor. According to my mother, I was what mothers call a difficult baby. Whiny, impossible to please, kvetchy, and a complete pain wimp about everything. All my early memories are around avoiding pain, around avoiding intense emotions in adults. I just couldn't handle being, or if someone had a bereavement or something, it's like I just could not relate. I just had to get out of there. So it was all about avoidance and agitation, and I would puke at the drop of a hat, So I'm taking this to mean that I was probably not a good candidate for what. So that this whole thing is a huge counterphobic attempt on my part to be okay. So so you go to the Zen Japanese torture chamber and so survive that, and then okay. So that's what I had in mind.
A personal follow-up: are you synesthetic?
I'm not particularly aware of synesthesia in the classical sense of synesthesia, although there is maybe another kind of synesthesia that happens as a result of long-term meditating, which is that all the senses start to seem the same. They have the same taste. They're the taste of vibrant vacuity. I know that doesn't sound very appealing, but actually, it's actually really cool. Try it, you'll like it. There's a poem by a Catholic poet, San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross. It was written in the 16th century. And it's poetry, so poetry is about taste. And San Juan was one of the great Christian mystics. And if you read this poem, it's called La Noche Oscura, the dark night. En una noche oscura, con ansias en amores inflamada, oh dichosa ventura, salí sin ser notada, estando ya mi casa sosegada. That's how it starts, okay? On a dark night, on fire with longing for love, I left, unnoticed, my house being still at last. Those of you who speak Spanish know that's a pretty good translation of what the Spanish was. So what's this about? Some girl sneaking out for an amorous adventure? Or the mystic leaving the limited identity after the mind and body, the house, had finally settled enough? Well, in fact, it's about the latter, but in the form of an amorous love adventure that some girl is going out at night, okay? Poem is almost pornographic. You can hardly imagine it was written by a Catholic priest in the age of the Inquisition. And when you're done reading that poem, you're left with two tastes simultaneously. A taste of incredible sensuousness and a taste of absolute vacuity and emptiness. Cesó todo y dejando mi cuidado entre las azucenas olvidado. Everything stopped, and I was set free, abandoning my cares, forgotten among the lilies. So that's the one taste that tends to emerge with time. So we have time for maybe a couple more. Ted?
So a lot of things that are deemed or seem to be mystical and therefore inexplicable to a lot of us, might they have arisen because they're actually, what they're actually doing, they arose because they're basically enhancing concentration, clarity, and equanimity. And they all did it from different sorts of metaphysical sounding places, but the reason why they arose is because they're all sort of ringing on the same tune.
Could you give me a little more specific of some more specifics about what you mean by mystical and so forth?
Even maybe less like ceremony. Why is, the ceremony not? Why are ceremonies so common in different human cultures? And maybe it's because you can make explanations for why they arose, but maybe because they all enhance concentration. So the reason why the ceremonies arose is because they had that fundamental feature, and so it sort of drove people.
That would be an interesting paradigm for viewing anthropology, right? To what extent, it's sort of like, what would it be? Sort of like mindfulness-centered sociology or something. It's like, to what extent are fundamental mindfulness skills really what's been driving human history? I hadn't thought about that till now, and that's sort of really cool. It's a cool idea.
Well, this has been on the tip of my tongue all afternoon, and you've alluded to it at various times, but what is time from your view?
So the question was, what is time? I'm half tempted to give a very flippant and cavalier answer to your question. So why don't you indulge me? Let me give you a flippant and cavalier answer to your question, and then see if I can actually give you something more substantive. Although, well, anyway, let me just try. So here's the flippant and cavalier answer to your question. The way physicists, specifically in the field of general relativity, tend to think about time is they give an operational definition of time. So basically, according to Einstein and those types of people, time is what gets measured by a clock. Okay, that's what time is.
And that's my background. I'm mathematics, multiple degrees in mathematics.
Oh, multiple degrees in mathematics.
And studied relativity.
What specialties in math? What areas?
I taught galactic mechanics and physics.
Oh yes,
and,
so you.
Of course, heavily using calculus and all that. I have a cousin that was part of he designed with his team of 50 or 70 people, the actual machine that measured the Higgs boson as it was spinning out after those tremendous collisions.
Well, maybe we could get together afterwards. Exchange derivatives.
And then I was thinking, and I've thought of that from the scientific approach, and I even use calculus. Well, X approaching 0 or something like that, but not quite getting to 0. But then I was thinking more of just the experience.
Well, I haven't yet given you my flippant answer.
Oh, yeah.
Since you're in this field, in that essay, the What is Mindfulness, I make a metaphor, okay? It's just a metaphor. I'm not one of these, like, naive, what the belief, you know, people that equate science with spirituality flippantly, okay? But I have a really elaborate metaphor that I think you're going to really enjoy, with a singularity and an event horizon, etc. It's only a metaphor, okay? But it's picture. I show 10 stages in the what happens to the subjective perception of time as you get closer and closer to complete experience. And basically what happens is that linear, now this is subjective experience of time, right? Not the physicist's definition of time. So the subjective experience of time is normally linear, right? We get a sense that theoretically there's an infinite past and an infinite future, and there's this sort of linear thing. What happens is it actually gets bent. It sort of gets bent, past and future, until there's a one-point compactification in the language of topology.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's the absolute. Then future and past collapse, okay? And time gets bent into cyclic time. It's just, time comes into and out of existence like this, cyclically. And when it comes into existence, past and future open up. And when it goes out of existence, past and future collapse into absolute now. This is the subjective experience of time. And it's actually, like, topologically a one-point compactification, so to speak, since you're in the field. So that actually, that was the real answer to your question. So now let me just give you the flippant answer.
Oh, we haven't gotten there.
No, we haven't. I was going to open with that, but then when you told me that you were a mathematical physicist, then that put it in a different footing. Now the flippant answer is the Tina Turner version of the physicist's answer. Okay. Which is, what's time got to do with it? What's time but a second hand in motion? Okay, I'm sorry. I couldn't. And we're done, folks. Thanks for your interest in these things, and thanks for Amrit. And that's it. I'll hang around for a few minutes if you want to catch up.